Okay, we've talked a fair bit about elements of culture, um, the the underpinnings, the economic aspects, the how you make a living, how you survive, how you organize your societies, and what those societies contain in terms of elements, religion, language, um, social status, things like art and music, your identity, who you are, what people you belong to, your family, how you behave, what your gender is. These are all elements within society. But anthropology also turns its mirror on itself from time to time and looks at more recent things and the society that anthropology as a discipline exists in. So we're coming into more modern times. We're not looking at historic periods. We're not looking at necessarily ancient periods, but we do have to turn our attention back a little bit to the foundation of how modern Western society, the world that we live in, came to be in order to understand what it is. And so today we're going to look at the world as it exists today, and the next chapter will look at that as well. But we're going to be looking at it through the lens of large principles. And that's kind of has to be done because what we're talking about are world systems and globalization. Now, globalization is something that you can look at as a big interacting system that exists on a planetary scale, but it also has local impacts. It has local effects. So what we've talked about in the past about what your identity is, what sort of social organization you have, what sort of economy you have, is affected by the fact that we live in an interconnected global world system. And before we come to that, though, I want to just start off today by asking a basic question. It's a question that I asked when I was a student, and frankly, no one could give me a very good answer. And so I'm going to give you the answer today. I was studying for a class on economics and politics. I think it was some sort of social studies class of some sort. I can't remember exactly. But we were talking about the economy, and we came to national economies and things like gross domestic product, GDP. And you see that GDP rises. GDP, you gain GDP, gross domestic product. And economies get bigger and better and stronger and wealthier, at least where I grew up in America. And I asked a basic question: how does growth, economic growth, happen? And the reason why I asked this very silly question, but one that no one could answer until I figured it out on my own through reading and observation, was that, well, I'll come to the answer in a moment. But here was my perplexing question is, let's take our monetary system that we get by with dollars, right? So dollars represent value of some sort. And so let's say there's a person who has some basic commodities. Let's call it water on one side, and this person over here has food on this side. And they've invested their labor, and each person on either side of this transaction says, I have water, you want water. This person says, I have food, you want food. So they say, okay, my water is worth $2, so I want your $2. So it changes hands, and the water seller now has $4, but they want food. And the food seller over here says, I want $2 for my food, and it comes back, right? So you have what you started with. Now let's say there's some commodity out there that is in imbalance, that someone has gold on this side and food on this side. And gold isn't necessarily intrinsically valuable, but let's say this person with food says, you know what, I'm going to pay you $2 for that gold, and the gold seller says, I'm only going to pay you $1 for that food because my gold is worth more than your food. Now, you still got $4. You haven't increased the amount of value in this system. You're just circulating it and maybe concentrating it in one person's hands. Where does value increase? How does GDP get larger through time? And the reason why no one could answer this question, or maybe no one would answer this question to me when I was a child, is because the answer is theft. Stealing. Our economy is very powerful. The United States economy is extremely powerful because we take things from people and then we sell them on at a price that we didn't pay for them. So this is kind of the dirty little secret to economic systems, and in fact to the world system that we find ourselves in today. That we, in America, are actually in a really good spot because we have the power to be able to take things from other people at a rate that is unfair to them. So that's how I want to introduce this, and we'll come back to this idea time and again in this chapter and in the next. The concept of that we call the world systems theory is actually a historical concept that was in the 1970s and 80s. A historian named Emanuel Wallerstein, who studied colonialism in the age of discovery and the early mercantilism of the 16th and late 15th century. And so he was looking at the establishment of a type of economic system that we find ourselves in today, but he found its roots going back to basically the discovery of the New World by Columbus in 1492, and which opened up the floodgates of Europeans moving out into the world and colonizing them and finding resources that would come back into Europe and make them increasingly wealthy. So, as part of Emanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, he conceived of it in three parts, which he called the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. And the core, in his definition, were these European powerful nations that went out and colonized and invested in foreign places that may not have even conceived of themselves as a nation at the time. North and South America didn't have countries. They had people living there, but they weren't organizing themselves in terms of boundaries that you could define, legal precedent that you could appeal to. That's not to mean that they weren't sophisticated. It's just that it was oranges coming up against apples, and the Europeans came in with very powerful technology and advanced capital-intensive products that were appealing to some of the people that they were coming in contact with. And they were able to, slowly but surely, the European nations were able to take over these peripheral nations, which peripheral nations consist of, or places, locations are less mechanized. They have primarily concerned with producing raw materials and agricultural goods and human labor, whereas the core nations, in this case in the colonial periods, the European nations were technologically advanced. They had capital-intensive products, and they produced and exported these products to semi-peripheral and peripheral nations, zones. The Semi-periphery, which is we sometimes refer to as developing nations, are ones that are industrialized and export like a core nation, but they don't have the sort of power and economic dominance over other regions. So they're somewhere in between the core and the periphery, and then in the middle you have the semi-periphery that are more like the core, but don't have very much power. And today, core countries rely on things like, they still rely on this system, but it's changed slightly because most countries don't have colonies anymore. But this has been sort of flipped around, and instead of colonization, core countries tend to rely on things like immigration from the periphery and the semi-periphery to provide things like cheap labor. But alternatively, you can outsource this, and so colonization takes place by making a call center that once was housed in Omaha, Nebraska. You shift it to a much cheaper labor market in India. So once again, we still have this perpetuation of core and periphery nations in our current economic world system. So the history of this goes back to the discovery of the New World, and actually maybe a little bit earlier with the intention of going to the China and India and and Oceania for raw materials in Europe, which they were desperate for some of these materials that were coming from the east. And Columbus tried to go to the west and found a new landmass that they didn't know about, and then that became exploited in addition to the raw materials that could be gotten from the east as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about in this chapter about how this developed in Europe and what effects this had, the establishment of this economic system had on the places that were coming into contact. Now, the development of this modern world system started in the European Age of Discovery, and things like common items today, like sugar, were actually quite expensive to produce, and the international market for sugar and cotton and eventually tobacco, things like that were needed to be mass produced with human labor, created the development of the transatlantic slave trade. And New World plantations were based on an economy that was underpinned by slave trade. And so it wasn't just commodities, it was the human labor market was also part of this world system. And so you can see how much of an impact this had on communities that were come into contact. These were taking people out of their communities and treating them like property, selling them on. How devastating would that be to the communities that were affected? This also, in terms of commodification, meant that in the 16th and 17th century, these plantations were growing one type of cash crop. And so what had once been a diverse range of food and commodities that were being grown and produced led to things like deforestation and a less diverse subsistence base. Now, how was this all possible, and why did it take off when it did? Well, the population increase in Europe was leading to, and some technological innovations were leading to industrialization. And it took place in different places in different ways. The United Kingdom, Britain, was the main driving force of industrialization, actually England in particular. And one of the reasons why it took the Industrial Revolution took off in England rather than in a place like, let's say, France, is because France had a larger population. France had a far larger population than England did, and England was competitors with France, but France could just throw people at manufacturing, and then they could sell them on, and France was getting selling these products on, charging cheap labor, and then the owners of this manufacturing would then make great profits. This would also enrich the state coffers in France. In England, however, with a smaller population, you couldn't exploit that labor. And so technology started to be invented that took the place of mechanizing what was once done by hand. And so industrialization also drew upon the fact that England, places like England, have abundant natural resources like coal, iron ore, they've got waterways, and a great coastline where they could ship things abroad and bring things in. And so the Industrial Revolution really took off in Britain more than France to begin with. And but what were they producing, right? And although Britain has the raw materials to be able to run factories and mechanized factories like that in industrial scale, what are they producing? Well, if you want to create textiles, where's that coming from? Sure, they have wool, but they don't have cotton, they don't have silk. So where do you get those from? You've got to go outside of the UK to find these raw materials, to the east, to the west, and who does that for you? Well, you might actually set up a colony of people that can produce that for you, and then you've got a direct main line to the places where these raw materials can be found. This is sort of at the root of why Britain started to colonize the world. And France only later on did that, and for some slightly different reasons, as we'll see here. Now, let's talk a little bit about this industrialization and what it did to the people that were in the industrialized world in these early days. So we've talked a little bit about Karl Marx before. Well, he has some things to say about this. He was living at sort of a peak of industrial revolution, and he came up with sort of the defining works on how we understand industrialized world. We've come a fair ways since his time, but we still use some of these terms that he came up with. He saw that the capitalist economy and capital, in case you are unclear on what the word capital it means, is capital refers to wealth that is invested with the intent of producing profit. So that profit-based motive that I started out with is part of capitalization or capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. That's really what industrializing production is all about, is you're trying to increase your profit by having fewer outgoings. You don't want to pay as much in labor. If you can just have a machine running and doing your work all day long, then you're not paying as much to produce something that someone will then give you profit for. So Marx saw that with the Industrial Revolution, we were coming out of an old system of feudalism and land ownership into a more urbanized, industrialized economy where you had opposition between two basic classes, and that was what he called the bourgeoisie, which was the capitalists, the owners of the factories, the people that got the profits, and the proletariat, which was the working class, the people that actually were on the shop floors, the people sticking the parts together, the people putting themselves in harm's way to run these machineries and fix them. And they were not actually getting the profits. They were getting a wage, and it was usually minimized because the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, were trying to maximize the profits that they got. So their labor force was intentionally being minimized through industrial forms of labor, so through mechanization. And when you did have to employ humans, you paid them as little as you possibly could get away with. And this actually created what Marx called class consciousness, that people actually organized themselves into these groups. He observed the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but these groups, he was just making observations of groups that were already formed. He didn't invent those classes, he was observing them and giving them names. And this was, class consciousness was basically an identity formed around a commonality of interest that's based on your economic stratum. So working class was not a pejorative, that was something you could be proud of. I'm a member of the working class. But again, we go back to this idea of ideology that Marx said this is all a mask, that all of these social ideologies, pride in one's work and that sort of thing, is masking the fact that capitalism is trying to minimize you and marginalize you. And he saw that the greedy bourgeoisie were also benefiting from this ideology as well, that saw themselves as better than and at a higher status and a higher standing, and they deserved the greater riches from their profits. Now, in our modern system, this has been a little bit balanced out to some extent, because a growing middle class of skilled and professional workers has increased social equality that complicates social stratification. Because, especially here in America, and I speak to my European friends about this, my British friends about this, that there's still a very strong sense of economic class identity in the United Kingdom. Whereas here, more and more people consider themselves to be middle class, even if economically they're on the lower end of that or the higher end of that. The middle class, as it expands, it masks the fact that there's actually still a lot of complexity in our social stratification, but we're all just lumping it into one term, one overarching terminology, that is to say the middle class. And while we're losing that picture, we're failing to realize that a new bourgeoisie, a new unobtainable class is running away from us and leaving all of us lowly middle class people behind. That the billionaires and the 0.01% are increasingly widening that gap. Whereas this was all out in front of you in the Industrial Revolution, it's now hidden and masked.